We often hear the phrase, the first pharaohs. But what did that title truly mean more than 5,000 years ago? To speak of a pharaoh is to speak not just of a king, but of a ruler who embodied divine power, who united two lands and ruled as both man and God. The story of Egypt's earliest monarchies is both fascinating and elusive, resting on fragments of pottery, half-erased names, and legends repeated centuries later. And yet, from those scattered traces, we can still glimpse the dawn of one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history. Tradition tells us that Egypt's monarchy began around 3100 BC, with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under a single ruler. Many have identified this man as Narmer, remembered also in later writings as Menes, the founder of the First Dynasty. On a famous ceremonial palette, Narmer is shown wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, a symbolic act of unification that echoes across time. But while that palette is a striking piece of propaganda, the real origins of Egyptian kingship are more complicated, and they begin even earlier than Narmer. Archaeologists working at Abydos have uncovered tombs and inscriptions from rulers who predate Narmer, the so-called Dynasty Zero. Among them are figures like Iry-Hor and Ka. Their names appear on jars, seal impressions, and crude hieroglyphs scratched into stone. They do not yet carry the full titulary of later pharaohs, and their tombs are modest compared with what would come later. Yet they stand as proof that the idea of kingship was already forming in Upper Egypt long before the celebrated unification. Imagine the Nile Valley in this early time. Small villages scattered along the fertile floodplain, each led by local chiefs who controlled trade, farmland, and labor. These settlements prospered, competing and cooperating in equal measure. Farmers coaxed grain from irrigated fields, potters produced fine wares for trade, and artisans shaped copper and flint into tools and weapons. From these beginnings, the first stirrings of centralized authority emerged as stronger leaders extended influence over their neighbors. By the late 4th millennium BC, Upper Egypt was dotted with competing polities, each with its own emblem and standard. At Abydos, Hierakonpolis, and Naqada, these early states grew in power. They fought wars, exchanged goods, and developed rituals that asserted the divine nature of leadership. The falcon god Horus was already associated with kingship, his image emblazoned on standards that accompanied rulers in procession. Through conquest, marriage, and alliance, power consolidated, preparing the way for a single king to claim both lands. Narmer appears at the culmination of this process. His palette, discovered in the sacred precinct at Hierakonpolis, is not a literal record of events, but a symbolic proclamation. On one side, Narmer towers over a kneeling captive, striking with a mace in the age-old pose of victory. On the other, he wears the red crown and leads a procession of standards, his enemies laid out in defeat. Between them, fantastic beasts with intertwined necks suggest the union of the two lands under his command. These images declare not just a political conquest, but the birth of a cosmic order, the pharaoh as guarantor of balance between chaos and harmony. Yet questions remain. Was Narmer truly the first pharaoh, or was he simply the most successful of a series of rulers who had already begun the work of unification? Later Egyptian king lists speak of a legendary founder named Menes. Some equate him with Narmer, others with his successor Hor-Aha, while some scholars suggest Menes is a conflation of several rulers into one mythic ancestor. The truth is uncertain, and the earliest history of Egypt resists a neat answer. What is clear is that kingship emerged gradually, from local rulers experimenting with power to monarchs who embodied the full ideology of pharaonic rule. After Narmer, his successors built upon this fragile foundation. Hor-Aha, Jir, Det, and others of the first dynasty established Memphis as a political center, constructed royal tombs at Abydos, and expanded the rituals of kingship. Administrative offices developed to manage agriculture, taxation, and labor. Egypt was divided into nomes, or provinces, each governed by officials loyal to the king. Offerings to the gods became standardized, and the cult of the king himself grew in importance. The image of the ruler as the living Horus, chosen by the gods to maintain Ma'at, the divine order, became central to Egyptian thought. The archaeology of this period reveals both grandeur and fragility. The Palermo stone, a fragment of royal annals, records reign lengths, tax collections, and Nile flood levels, though its surviving sections are incomplete. Clay ceilings from tombs preserve names of early rulers, but many are ambiguous or missing. The Turin canon and the Abydos king list, compiled centuries later, provide only partial chronologies. What we know of the first pharaohs is therefore built on broken pieces and echoes, leaving as many questions as answers. Still, their impact is undeniable. By the end of the first dynasty, Egypt possessed a unified territory stretching hundreds of miles along the Nile, a centralized administration, and a belief system that elevated the king above ordinary men. Kings sponsored temple building, organized large labor forces, and expanded long-distance trade with Nubia, Sinai, and the Levant. The seeds of empire had been planted. These rulers also pioneered the tradition of monumental tombs. At Abydos, their enclosures were vast mud brick structures, precursors to the stone pyramids that would rise centuries later. Within these tombs lay grave goods of exquisite craftsmanship, carved stone vessels, ivory tags, and imported luxury items. They reflected not only the wealth of the court, but also the desire to prepare the king for an eternal journey. In their funerary practices, we see the first outlines of beliefs that would define Egyptian religion for millennia. But kingship was more than ritual and monument. It was a living ideology, one that had to be constantly reinforced. The pharaoh's role as mediator between gods and men was affirmed in festivals, processions, and public ceremonies. Ordinary Egyptians might have lived simple lives, farming, fishing, and crafting, yet they saw their labor as part of a divine order upheld by the king. Through him, the Nile flooded, the sun rose, and the gods were appeased. So who was truly Egypt's first pharaoh? Was it Iry-Hor, the earliest ruler whose name we can tentatively read? Was it Ka, whose tomb at Abydos foreshadowed royal enclosures? Was it Narmer, who wore both crowns and claimed to unite the two lands? Or was it Menes, remembered in later tradition as the founder of Egypt? Perhaps the real answer is that there was no single first pharaoh, but rather a long dawn in which power, ritual, and ideology slowly fused into the institution we recognize today. And perhaps that is the most important lesson. History rarely begins with a single name or date. It begins in fragments, in gradual changes, in a slow accumulation of ideas. The first pharaohs of Egypt were not born fully formed. They emerged through centuries of struggle, innovation, and myth-making. From their world of mud-brick towns and modest tombs would rise pyramids, temples, and one of the most enduring civilizations the world has ever known. The Nile still flows as it did 5,000 years ago, carrying with it the memory of those earliest kings. Their names may be half forgotten, their records incomplete, but their legacy endures in the civilization they created. When we ask who the first pharaoh was, we are really asking how human ambition became sacred power, how a leader became a god, and how memory became legend. If you have enjoyed this journey into the deep past, remember this is only one chapter in the grand story of humanity. On Secrets of Empires, we explore the rise and fall of civilizations across the world, from pharaohs and emperors to forgotten kings and ancient peoples. Subscribe and join us as we continue unveiling the truths that history tried to hide.